Welcome back. In this video, I would like to share with you some thoughts about the culture. And I would like to start with the concepts that that started this upheaval about censorship and cancel culture. The concepts of disinformation and misinformation that became relevant during the 2016 election. Disinformation is an intentional endeavor to misinform people. We must remember that it was basically Russia, Putin's efforts, bought factories that spread lots of disinformation during that period. Now, did it work? It depends. For instance, they had some dirty tactics of reproducing websites that look like mainstream media to spread disinformation. But that not basically that had a very limited effect. What we are talking about here is the effort to spread disinformation through social media. And that practically pretty much didn't work because the only segments of the market where it worked were in those dark corners of Facebook where people were already on board with that kind of message, with conspiracy theories. So, in practical terms, it didn't change. It didn't persuade people who were not on board already with that kind of whoppers. Similarly, in the 2020 election and during the pandemic, more harmful were the contradictions between Fauci and the CDC, and that coming from a person who backed vaccine mandates. Different is the case of disinformation spread by physicians, but which should not solve through censorship in social media, but through bringing accountability to physicians who purposely spread dubious cures. That brings us to cancel culture. We see that even though this information didn't have the alleged effects on voters or public opinion, yet they unleashed a trend of cancel culture where people with dissenting opinions were marginalized. And somehow we allowed that to slip to the rest of the culture, even in entertainment. So you see, for instance, in the case of Harvey Weinstein, who was deservedly convicted of sex offense, that the victims of sexual harassment proposed that ways to allow women who didn't have a voice to have a chance to expose the cases in which they have already been victims, that it was not this only way to help women who have already name recognition. And yet, this movement, Me Too, at point, at some point, it lost the compass and turned into something related to the defamation cases of Johnny Depp and his wife, or about Matt Damon, whether Matt Damon should apologize or should be canceled because he refused to put Harvey Weinstein and Al Franken in the same bag. So is this case of where is cancel culture became not just annoying but even dangerous. Why? Because it spread like a cancer. So an example of that are the bans of books proposed by the right in public schools. You among the casualties of this war was Toni Morrison, because she was portraying slavery for the atrocity it was. And but the left, the far left, has also been present in this cancel culture. Just remember the case of the movie Sound of Freedom. This movie, Sound of Freedom, was vilified because it mentioned sexual abuse against children, and something that not long ago had been the war flag of QAnon. But just because the issue, so the thing of the movie is the same, should it mean that we are going to put Sound of Freedom and QAnon in the same bag? I watched the movie, and people who have watched the movie have seen no grounds for this ridiculous accusation. Yet it is, it has, there was a campaign to prevent people to boycott this movie just because this ridiculous association with QAnon. And then a field in which the far left has been much more effective has been in the case of video games. I don't play video games, but I have no problem with people who like video games. The matter is that the their efforts, the efforts of the far left of to ostracize and expel from the industry people who were not in line with their causes, the causes that they declared were on fashion, has been very notorious. You could see a little bit the effects of this controversy in entertainment. For instance, the huge discrepancies in the case of Rotten Tomatoes and the public, or the opinion of the public in movies like Song of Freedom, on the case of the left, or in the case of the right, if you want to call it the right, or in the case of cases of the series The Acolyte or the animation series Vilma. This may sound trivial if you want, but it shows a little bit how a critic that has aligned pretty much with the left has become detached of what the public wants. And this could be trivial, could be become a little dangerous because when when entertainment because entertainment could be escapism, and that's okay, or it could also be about a message. I like Rambo, Terminator, and John Wick as much as I like Syriana, Philadelphia, and The Help. Yet, Syriana presents a very compelling uh, questioning of our foreign policy. As for Philadelphia, they made a lot to make people empathize with gay people, as well as The Help question our perceptions on race. And that's fine. Those both are fine. But when we let ourselves, we let entertainment be infected by this far left ideology, if you want to call it ideology. I call it more whims. If for the whims of infected by the whims of the far left, you begin you start seeing people questioning people entertainment that has a message, and associating any message with the kind of trivial whimsy message of the far left. In other words, people start rejecting movies that may have a message, a constructive message, just because they have been led to believe that any movie that has a message has to be a portrait of the whims and caprice of the far left. This this can reach very ridiculous levels. For instance, about the race of the actors. But what are we going to do with Laurence Olivier, Anthony Hopkins, and also Orson Welles, who portrayed Othello? Are we going to cancel them? So, because the Othello, the Shakespeare character, was black, or even more ridiculous levels about rebranding brands, because renaming brands like the Jemima level controversy, because it was supposedly demeaning for the black race, and so on. So let me leave you with the intermission, and then we will talk about more about we will talk about a bit more about this issue.
Good evening. This is Brian Thomas Simons, and these are the main headlines of this hour. Among other news, after disappointing results in the PISA tests, math and science elective courses will be offered as elective subjects in high school curricula in the United States. That way, at least we will have a good justification for the poor results, declared Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona. Worried about the latest mathematics assessment by the National Assessment of Educational Progress, Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona declared, what is now known as Answer A, given by 77% of the students at grade 12, 89% if we exclude students of Asian descent, is particularly worrisome. It was originally intended as a joke, but we never expected results like these. We are currently assessing options. I particularly blame TikTok. Peru inaugurates its 14th president in the last 14 months. Undeniably, Peruvians have acquired practice in democracy after having had to go so many times to the voting polls in little more than a year, declared the president of the Catholic University, Carlos Garatea Grau. This has been the news of the hour.
Sponsored by Jill Stein for president. We dare you to believe that with your vote, it's possible that Jill can jump from 1% to 51%, so Trump will not be reelected. Jill's psychiatric diagnosis will bring her into harmony with her spirit guides. Jill's bicycle song will rank #1 in Rolling Stone. Jill will align her chakras and yours. Believe, an ad approved by Jill Stein for president and the American Psychiatric Association. Chip in. We accept Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover.
Welcome back. No, my problem is not just how annoying it could be the whims of the far left, the woke left, in the debate, in the culture wars. It's just something much more fundamental. It's trivialization. If you see the priorities of Black people, you don't see blackface, you don't see the renaming bases or renaming Jemima level. You see, for instance, concerns about the economy and education, about opportunity, about the access of Black business owners to credit. And yet the culture has led us to believe that basically the core of the Black people concerns is the penal system. We have to depenalize a little bit. It's not that the penal system is not something we have to deal with. But even when you ask Black people, it's not at the top of their priorities. Yes, yet it's one of Black Lives Matter top flags. We see Pew Research we see polls made by Pew Research among Black people and Latino people, and definitely those are not the priority. When we allow whimsy activists, cool activists, as I call them, to dictate us what the priorities of minorities are, we end up with these ridiculous outcomes. And the problem is that, for instance, that takes visibility away from something, from things that are actually important. Like, for instance, the Voting Rights Act. Since the Supreme Court struck the teeth of this legislation, and yet what we see is concerns about blackface, about Jemima labels, about Black actors in Marvel, about all these ridiculous things. And my question is, are those the priorities of Black and Latino people? And in the case of trans people, life is not sweeter. There are many cases. We need definitely more research about the reasons behind those huge cases of depression among trans people. We need to find better ways of protecting the mental health of trans people. Yet this woke left for this woke left, the priorities is again Marvel characters or getting trans athletes to compete with women in women's sports, and despite the outcomes, like in the cases of Leah Thomas, or that MMA fighter that sent her female opponent to the hospital. So, are those the priorities of trans people? No. So, the same way the Latino, the Black community, as in the Black community, the Latino community also have priorities linked to basically economic opportunity and education. And yet, we have devoted more time to the term Latinx, even though it's overwhelmingly rejected by the Hispanic community, and only 2 to 4%, depending on the poll, identify as Latinx. It looks like a distraction, and that's why, for instance, that's why the Hispanic community has become increasingly detached from the Democratic Party. The same thing with this discussion about pronouns. Now, before I go to the pronouns, let me address some issues on the culture wars, in which we have to go into some nuisance. There are issues in which the problem is disinformation and misinformation, like immigration, because as I mentioned in my second long video, there is no line. Legally, there is no line for those. So there is no equal opportunity. There is no fairness for those who have not been attached or born in the right castes of birth, what JFK called accidents of birth. Then we have cases of errors. For instance, puberty blockers, as a recent study in the United Kingdom, there are as many harmful effects on teens as we have beneficial effects when it comes to puberty blockers. So why not waiting until this person is old enough to make his own decisions legally? Then we have the cases of defund the police and the decriminalization of shoplifting in California. Actually, it was Proposition 47 that turned into misdemeanors many things that previously were felonies. And the problem is that those who were pushed by drug problems to these activities by drug problems didn't come with the help they needed, and these illicit activities skyrocketed to the point of discrediting any attempt at justice system reform. Then we have the delirant extremes of the new feminism, because I am for women's rights, but not for the ridiculous position of this last wave of the latest wave of feminism. And then we have issues on which we have to find to get a deal, to get a settlement, like abortion. On the one side, you have that if you are trying to defend pro-life positions on religious grounds, I should remind you that in Numbers 5:27, the Bible defends at least one case of abortion, and it calls it miscarriage. If you, on the other hand, I don't want to go into the semantic differences between baby and fetus, because at the end of the term, what we get is not a box of cleaners or a doll, but we get a baby. But on the other hand, you have to consider the baby because the mother doesn't want it. And Republicans don't want to take care of it. And that baby has not only economic, but also emotional, affective needs. So probably we should try to find a settlement, a solution in which we promote sexual education, contraception, and find terms of protection for women more close to the European lines that were a bit less generous than Roe v. Wade. Because this is a matter in which it's a matter of values in which you cannot prove the other side wrong. It's just what side is going to prevail. And for as long as we don't get a settlement, this issue is going to be used as a war flag by the streams. And having said that, let me go to the pronouns. Why should you be forced to state pronouns or ask for pronouns? That's ridiculous. Respect is something that should not be even questioned. But to let whimsy cool activists dictate that the way you express your respect is by asking pronouns is precisely an invitation to a backlash. The same thing with safe spaces. Curiously, these safe spaces has created a trend to a new kind of segregationism, neo-segregationism proposed precisely by these cool activists. I, as a Martin Luther King man, cannot oppose more. So, and why this detachment? This detachment has started and rose as I mentioned, as the Democratic Party before became the party of the well-educated, and this has been portrayed, mentioned from Thomas Piketty at the left to Farid Zakari at the center. And let me give you another reason why this is particularly dangerous. And this this has been especially noticeable in the Snow White controversy, because when in times of uncertainty, when the working class feels so betrayed that it starts turning to another party, many of them will take a refuge in nostalgia. And Snow White is part of those golden years. So a much better, nicer, they saw a nicer world in this kind of stories that now are being turned upside down just to please a group of cool activists who have never suffered a day in their life and yet want to dictate solutions for those who have never had a good day in theirs. So, where this come from? Well, here I would like to mention three books that you could find useful. That is Death of a King by Tavis Smiley, Let the Trumpet Sound by Stephen Oates, and is Stockley Alive by Peniel E. Joseph. And why I mentioned it is this because Martin Luther King proposed a message of empathy, a message of integration, while Stockley Carmichael proposed a message of disruption, of segregation, and he was even he who used probably was the first one who used this term systemic racism. And this is a very telling difference because it proposes two completely opposite paths to improve the lives of minorities. That's why, even though they were personal friends, had some hard words for the Black Power movement that in 1968 took much of the popularity that King had in the previous years. Many factors contributed to that. It was the opposition, some opposition to even inside the Democratic Party to King's desire to expand political rights to the economic field. But the matter is that this was irresponsibly capitalized by Stockley Carmichael and his movement. And what did he give minorities in return? Just vulgar displays of power. Now, where can we find something resembling Martin Luther King's message now? It's in the Poor People's Campaign. And if you see the priorities and concerns are not the same concerns or priorities of Black Lives Matter or these cool activists, the far left that want to make every character in Disney gay or black or Latino or whatever. This brings me to my last 2 points: cultural appropriation and safe spaces. Cultural appropriation is a term that started when people began to notice that many of Elvis songs had actually been created by black musicians who never got credit for their work. Then it was adapted in the case of musicians like James Brown and Prince, who made a fraction of the money of artists with similar popularity who happen to be white. So, and of course, you had to, in those cases, you had to support the concept of cultural appropriation because it was an injustice. You had to give black artists their due. But then, at some point, like in the Me Too movement, once these cool activists started to touch the issue, they became a synonym of the concept that you could not, you had to live in your enclave. Unless you were a minority, or even if you were a minority, depending on who activists you asked, you have to only use the cultural products of your culture of birth. So it was practically a very medieval conception in which you had to be born as a peasant in the Middle Ages. You have to live and born inside your culture and never go beyond that. It was it was the most un-American concept you could think of. And this was, is, of course, reinforced by concept that you needed to safe spaces where you could be isolated from the rest of the mainstream. Instead of changing the mainstream, you could live in your, or you had to live inside your enclave, inside your cultural enclave, and pretty much become an ethnic stereotype. That is something that is, as I said, is the most one of the most un-American buzzwords. It's not even, it doesn't deserve even to be called a concept. It's because my values are based on the notion of empathy. Because empathy implies that you see the other and the other can see you as equals, that you have something to share with the other. That's why the other can at least get close to feel what you feel. And because it's very, very hard to feel empathy for somebody to whom you see as different, as an ethnic stereotype. It's much more easier to rationalize the pain of that ethnic stereotype. And the other reason why I abhor this term cultural appropriation is because I am a big supporter of the melting pot. And don't come to me with that the melting pot implies submissive assimilation. No, it might have been the way it was defined during the years of nativism that gave birth to the 1921 and 1924 immigration reforms that were strictly nativist. But it's not the way we understand it today. Today, we understand that the melting pot consists of a mainstream to which every culture contributes, to which every immigrant, every generation contributes. And so this culture moves and it goes, we help this melting pot, this mainstream, go in the right direction. For instance, there is undeniable, we have had undeniable progress in the situation of women, of minorities, of gays and trans, though we still have to work a lot more in the case of trans. And it has not denied, not now, and not even in the early 20th century, the identity of those who feel a big attachment to the cultural roots. For instance, in Odessa, you could still, in the 20th century, you could speak Russian, in Little Italy, Italian, in Chinatown, you could speak Chinese, and if you go to a kosher market, you can speak Yiddish, and nobody gets out screaming because the person is not speaking English. So let's not be ridiculous. Now, let me conclude with an invitation. Mircea Eliade acknowledged that the foundational narratives that were incorporated in the myths and allowed us to explain our and perceived reality have moved in the modern era to to the popular culture. So the popular culture is the base on which those foundational narratives take place. And Mircea Eliade even mentioned the movies as movies and entertainment as ways in which these perceptions of the reality, these foundational narratives, are conveyed to the public. And here, if you have liked my approach, then you are let me mention that if these ideas has been part of these ideas has been published in an essay. The Scars magazine was kind enough to publish me in two parts. And here I would like to end by inviting you to read the story of Gatito Inmigrante. It's a story I wrote into 2012, and that incorporates mostly all these ideas that I have been talking about, the idea of empathy, ideas compassion that is pointless if you don't have empathy, an idea of the melting pot, an idea of that we are all part of this project called America. And is my contribution on this end in order to reject the buzzwords that have been so dominant in our culture nowadays and that have alienated so many people that should be in this endeavor on the same page. Remember, I acknowledge my biases as a Roosevelt liberal, but there are ideas at the right that are also good, as I mentioned in my first video. So let me help create this range between a rational left and a rational right, so we can escape to our loop of disappointment. And please, I need you to share this video. I need subscribers. Please subscribe to these videos, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.